"Get out, you're incompetent," the CEO said, but the intern revealed something shocking. Get ready for an absolutely incredible story that will leave you speechless. Today you're going to discover "Get Out, You're Incompetent," a powerful tale about prejudice, hidden talents, and how sometimes the people we underestimate the most can surprise us in the most extraordinary ways. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss our amazing stories. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this unfolds. The autumn rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Meridian Financial Tower, creating rivulets that distorted the view of downtown Chicago's bustling streets 52 floors below. The storm had been building since dawn, matching the tension that permeated the executive offices of Blackstone Consulting, one of the city's most prestigious consulting firms. Alexandra Chen hurried through the marble-floored corridors, her worn sneakers squeaking softly against the polished stone as she clutched a thick manila folder against her chest. At 22, she moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate corporate hierarchies without drawing unwanted attention. Her simple grey sweater and black slacks marked her clearly as an intern among the sea of expensive suits that populated these rarefied heights of business power. The folder in her hands contained 3 months of painstaking research that had consumed nearly every waking hour since she'd started her internship at Blackstone. She'd sacrificed weekends, stayed late into countless nights, and poured herself into analysis that she genuinely believed could transform the firm's approach to their most challenging client. Approaching the imposing double doors marked Richard Blackstone III, Chief Executive Officer, Alexandra paused to steady her nerves. Behind those doors sat a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning, brilliant, ruthless, and utterly intolerant of anything less than perfection. At 58, Richard had built Blackstone Consulting from a modest firm into a powerhouse that advised Fortune 500 companies across the nation. The nameplate gleamed in elegant gold lettering, catching light from the crystal chandeliers that illuminated the executive wing. Alexandra could hear voices from within, Richard's distinctive baritone mixed with what sounded like several senior executives discussing the Hartwell manufacturing account, a potential client worth $40 million in consulting fees. She knocked softly, barely audible above the conversation inside. When no response came, she knocked again, slightly louder this time. Finally, Richard's voice called out with unmistakable irritation, "Come in, but make it quick. We're discussing something important." Alexandra pushed open the heavy door and stepped into Richard Blackstone's command center. The office was vast by any standard, with multiple seating areas, a conference table for 20, and a desk positioned to maximize the spectacular city views. Original artwork adorned the walls, and every surface spoke of wealth accumulated through decades of business success. Richard sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Alexandra's semester tuition, and his pale blue eyes carried the kind of calculating intensity that had unnerved competitors for years. Around the conference table sat 5 senior executives, all impeccably dressed men who looked like they'd stepped from the pages of Business Week. "What is it?" Richard asked without looking up from the documents spread before him. His tone carried the dismissive impatience usually reserved for interruptions by people deemed unimportant. "I'm preparing for the most significant client presentation of the quarter." Alexandra cleared her throat softly, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the intimidating atmosphere. "Mr. Blackstone, I've completed the comprehensive analysis you requested on the Hartwell manufacturing situation. I believe I've identified some critical issues that weren't addressed in the preliminary reports." One of the senior executives, Peterson, she thought his name was, let out a barely suppressed snort. "Richard, why are we being interrupted by an intern? Don't we have assistants to handle this sort of thing?" Richard finally looked up, his pale eyes fixing on Alexandra with the kind of stare that had made seasoned executives uncomfortable. His expression mixed irritation with mild curiosity, as if he couldn't quite believe someone of her obvious junior status would dare interrupt such an important meeting. "Miss," he paused, clearly struggling to remember her name despite her 3 months at the company. "Miss Chen, isn't it? What exactly makes you think your analysis would contain anything our senior staff hasn't already covered? We have teams of Harvard and Wharton MBAs working on this account." The dismissive tone stung, but Alexandra had expected it. She'd grown accustomed to being underestimated during her time at Blackstone, where her youth, modest background and state school education marked her as someone to be overlooked rather than heard. "Sir, I understand the senior team has extensive experience," Alexandra replied carefully, "but I've been analyzing the Hartwell situation from a different perspective. I focused specifically on their supply chain vulnerabilities and identified patterns that suggest their problems run deeper than initially assumed." Richard leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers in a gesture calculated to convey authority and skepticism. "Miss Chen, do you understand what's at stake here? This is a $40 million account. Hartwell Manufacturing employs 15,000 people, and they're considering only 3 firms for this contract." The other executives nodded agreement, their expressions ranging from amused to openly hostile. These were men who had spent decades climbing corporate ladders, who had earned their positions through elite educations and carefully cultivated relationships. The idea that a state school intern might have insights they'd missed wasn't just unlikely, it was insulting. "I understand the importance of the account, sir," Alexandra persisted, though she could feel her confidence wavering under their collective skepticism. "That's exactly why I think you should look at what I've found. The data suggests Hartwell's problems could spread to their entire supplier network within 6 months. Richard's expression darkened considerably. The patience he'd been displaying, thin as it was, evaporated entirely. He stood from his chair, his imposing frame casting a shadow across the desk. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice now carrying real anger, "let me explain something about how the business world actually works. This isn't some college classroom where everyone's opinion has equal value. This is a multi-billion-dollar consulting firm where results matter more than good intentions." He moved closer, his presence intimidating in a way that made the large office feel suddenly claustrophobic. "You've been here for what, 3 months? You're an intern from some state university nobody's heard of. You have no experience, no credentials, and no understanding of how complex business relationships function." The words hit Alexandra like physical blows, each one designed to remind her of her place in the rigid hierarchy. She could feel her cheeks burning with embarrassment and anger, but forced herself to remain standing, to meet Richard's gaze without flinching. "The executives around this table," Richard continued, gesturing toward the assembled group, "have decades of combined experience. They've advised presidents and saved companies worth billions. And you think that in 3 months, working part-time while finishing your degree, you've discovered something they've missed." The senior executives were now openly smirking, clearly enjoying the public humiliation of someone they viewed as presumptuous. This was the kind of moment that reinforced existing power structures, reminding everyone about the importance of knowing one's place. "Mr. Blackstone, I'm not trying to challenge anyone's expertise," Alexandra managed. "I just think sometimes a fresh perspective can reveal things that might be overlooked." "A fresh perspective." Richard's voice rose slightly. "Miss Chen, this isn't about perspective. This is about competence. This is about understanding that there are levels of expertise you haven't reached and may never reach." He returned to his desk, his movements sharp with anger. "Do you know what it takes to build a relationship with a client like Hartwell? Do you understand the political complexities, the personal relationships, the years of trust building required for an account of this magnitude?" Alexandra opened her mouth to respond, but Richard held up a hand to silence her. Here's what I think happened, Richard continued, his tone now openly condescending. You've been given some busy work to keep you occupied. You've compiled data and organized files, and in your inexperience, you've mistaken routine information gathering for actual analysis. The office fell silent, except for the rain pattering against the windows. Outside, the storm was intensifying, turning the city grey and sending pedestrians scurrying for shelter. The fact that you would interrupt a senior executive meeting to present what you imagine to be groundbreaking insights shows fundamental poor judgment, Richard said, his voice deadly quiet. It shows inappropriate confidence and a failure to recognize your own limitations. Alexandra felt tears threatening, but she blinked them back with fierce determination. She would not give these people the satisfaction of seeing her break down. Mr. Blackstone, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I've spent 3 months on this analysis. I've identified potential supply chain failures that could cost Hartwell hundreds of millions. I really think you should look at what I've found. The manila folder felt heavier than ever, containing work that had consumed her life and represented her best effort to contribute meaningfully to the company. Richard stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through disbelief, irritation, and finally settling on rage. When he spoke again, his voice was loud enough for people in the outer offices to hear. Miss Chen, you are displaying exactly the kind of arrogance and poor judgment that makes me question our intern program entirely. You clearly don't understand your role here, and you certainly don't understand when to speak and when to listen. He moved back to his desk, slamming his hand down hard enough to make the expensive pens jump. The fact that you would waste my time and the time of these senior executives with amateur-level analysis shows a fundamental misunderstanding of your position in this organization. The senior executives watched with fascination, knowing this public humiliation would be discussed in hushed tones for months. Furthermore, Richard continued, his voice growing louder, your insistence on pursuing this, after I've made clear your input is neither needed nor wanted, suggests you may not be suited for the business world at all. Sir, Alexandra tried one more time, her voice shaking despite her efforts to remain composed, I understand your concerns about my experience, but the data shows patterns that could be crucial to understanding Hartwell's vulnerabilities. Could you at least look at the executive summary? Richard's face went through several shades of red as he processed what he clearly saw as continued insubordination. Miss Chen, he said finally, his voice cold and final, you are demonstrating exactly the kind of incompetence that has no place in a firm of this caliber. Your inability to recognize your limitations, your disrespect for established hierarchies, and your persistence in wasting valuable time shows that you fundamentally misunderstand what it means to work at this level. He moved around his desk and approached her directly. I've been patient because I believe in giving young people opportunities. But your behavior today has convinced me that you simply don't have what it takes to succeed in this environment. And the senior executives exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their agreement with Richard's assessment. These were men who had risen by understanding and respecting corporate hierarchies, by knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Your work here has been adequate at best, Richard continued, though Alexandra suspected he had no real knowledge of her actual contributions. But adequacy isn't enough in a competitive environment where excellence is the minimum standard. Alexandra felt her world tilting. This internship had been everything to her, not just a learning experience, but a pathway to a career that could lift her from modest circumstances. She had worked harder than anyone, sacrificed more, and genuinely believed her efforts would be recognized. Therefore, Richard said, his voice carrying absolute finality, I'm terminating your internship effective immediately. You can collect your belongings and leave within the hour. Security will escort you out. The words hit like a physical blow, leaving her momentarily speechless. Terminated, effective immediately. The phrases echoed like a death sentence for her carefully planned future. Furthermore, Richard added, I'll be noting in your file that termination was due to poor judgment, insubordination, and fundamental lack of competence. Any future employers who contact us will be informed of these concerns. The manila folder slipped from Alexandra's suddenly nerveless fingers, hitting the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the silent office. 3 months of work scattered across the expensive stone like fallen leaves. One of the senior executives chuckled quietly at her clumsiness, as if it was final confirmation of her incompetence. "Sir," Alexandra said, her voice barely audible, but carrying desperate determination, "please just look at the research. I know I'm just an intern, but the data shows something important about Hartwell's supply chain vulnerabilities." Richard's expression shifted to something approaching hatred. "Miss Chen, you have proven beyond doubt that you are completely incompetent. Not only do you lack necessary skills, but you apparently lack the basic intelligence to understand when you've been dismissed." He gestured sharply toward the door. "Get out of my office, get out of this building, and get out of my industry, because you clearly don't belong here. You are incompetent, insubordinate, and utterly unsuited for the business world." As Alexandra knelt to gather her scattered papers, fighting back tears of humiliation and rage, she felt something crystallizing inside her. The pain was real, the embarrassment almost unbearable, but underneath was a growing sense that Richard's assessment was fundamentally wrong. She had spent 3 months diving deeper into Hartwell's situation than anyone else in the firm. She had identified patterns and vulnerabilities that went beyond surface-level analysis, and she had done it while working longer hours with less support than any senior staff member. "Miss Chen," Richard said impatiently, "you're wasting more of my time. Security is on the way. I suggest you finish collecting your papers and leave with whatever dignity remains." "Oh." Alexandra straightened slowly, clutching the folder against her chest like armor. She looked around at the faces of the men who had just destroyed her career with such casual cruelty, memorizing their expressions of smug satisfaction. "Mr. Blackstone," she said, her voice stronger now despite the tears threatening at her eyes, "you're making a mistake. The research I've done could save Hartwell Manufacturing millions and position this firm ahead of every competitor. But you won't even look at it because you've decided someone like me couldn't possibly contribute anything valuable." Richard's face darkened further at what he perceived as continued defiance. "Miss Chen, you have exactly 5 minutes to leave before I have you removed by security. Your arrogance is matched only by your incompetence." As if summoned by his words, there was a knock on the door. "Come in," Richard called, clearly expecting security personnel. Instead, the door opened to reveal Margaret Walsh, Richard's executive assistant, her face bearing unusual urgency. "Mr. Blackstone," Margaret said, slightly out of breath, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have Robert Hartwell on line 1. He says it's urgent regarding this afternoon's presentation." The color drained from Richard's face. Robert Hartwell was the CEO of Hartwell Manufacturing, the man whose approval could make or break the $40 million contract. An urgent call hours before their crucial presentation could only mean trouble. "Tell him I'll be right with him," Richard said, his voice tight with anxiety. Margaret nodded and withdrew, leaving the office in tense silence. Alexandra remained frozen, still clutching her research, as Richard moved toward his phone with the careful steps of someone approaching disaster. "Robert," Richard said, activating the speaker so his executives could hear, "good to hear from you. I trust everything is on schedule for our presentation." Robert Hartwell's voice came through clearly, frustration unmistakable despite the electronic transmission. "Richard, I'm afraid we have a serious problem. I've just received some troubling information about potential vulnerabilities in our supply chain that weren't addressed in your preliminary proposal." The senior executives exchanged worried glances as Richard's face went white. I'm sorry to hear that, Robert, Richard managed. Perhaps you could help us understand your concerns so we can address them in today's presentation. The problem, Richard, is that I've just learned about potential failures in our supplier network that could cost us hundreds of millions if they're not addressed immediately. None of your preliminary analysis even mentioned these vulnerabilities. Deceased, Alexandra felt her heart racing as she realized Robert Hartwell was describing exactly the issues she had identified in her research, the same research that Richard had dismissed without looking at it. Robert, Richard said, panic creeping into his voice, I can assure you our team has conducted extremely thorough analysis. We've identified multiple areas where our expertise can provide immediate value. Richard, let me be direct. Robert's voice carried unmistakable frustration. What you've provided so far completely missed critical vulnerabilities that could destroy our company. If your team can't identify these kinds of systemic risks, I'm not sure you're the right firm for this engagement. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stared at the phone as if it might provide answers, while his senior executives looked like they were attending their own funeral. Furthermore, Robert continued, I've been doing my own analysis, and I've identified supply chain vulnerabilities that could affect not just our company, but dozens of manufacturers in our network. These are exactly the kinds of systemic risks I expect a top-tier consulting firm to identify. Alexandra's hands tightened on her folder as she realized Robert Hartwell had independently reached the same conclusions she had spent 3 months developing. The irony was unbearable. Validation of her research was coming from the very client Richard was desperate to impress. Robert, Richard said desperately, perhaps we could discuss these vulnerabilities you've identified. Our team is extremely flexible and prepared to adjust our approach based on new information. That's exactly the problem, Richard. These aren't new vulnerabilities. The data has been available for months. The fact that your senior consultants didn't identify these risks suggests you're not looking deep enough. The criticism was devastating. Richard's senior executives were now avoiding eye contact entirely, as if looking at each other might make the disaster more real. I'll be honest, Robert continued, unless I see something dramatically different in today's presentation, I'm prepared to look elsewhere for consulting services. Maybe it's time to consider firms that can provide the depth of analysis this situation requires. Richard's face had gone beyond pale to an almost grayish color, suggesting physical distress. Losing the Hartwell account would be a blow to the firm's reputation that could affect their ability to compete for similar contracts. Robert, I understand your frustration, and I want to assure you we take your concerns seriously. If you could provide specifics about these vulnerabilities, I'm confident we can address them. Richard, I'm not going to do your research for you, but I will say this. The vulnerabilities I'm seeing suggest supply chain failures that could cascade through dozens of companies over the next 6 months. Alexandra felt like the universe was playing a cosmic joke. Everything Robert Hartwell described was covered in detail in her research that Richard had dismissed as incompetent amateur work. The consultant who figures out these systemic risks and provides real solutions will earn a client for life, Robert continued. But right now, I'm not seeing that level of insight from your firm. Robert, I can personally guarantee that our presentation this afternoon will exceed your expectations, Richard said desperately. I hope so, Richard. But I have to tell you, I'm not optimistic. If today's presentation is as superficial as your preliminary proposal, I'll be forced to look elsewhere. The line went dead, leaving Richard staring at the phone like it had delivered his death sentence. The office fell into complete silence, except for the intensifying rain against the windows. For a long moment, nobody moved. The senior executives sat frozen, processing the magnitude of what they'd heard. Richard remained by his desk, his hand hovering over the phone as if he couldn't believe the conversation had happened. Finally, Peterson cleared his throat nervously. Richard, What exactly was Hartwell referring to regarding supply chain vulnerabilities? That wasn't in any of our analysis. Richard turned from the phone, his face showing panic and rage. I don't know, he admitted. Apparently, we've missed something significant. Could we get additional research done before this afternoon? Another executive asked hopefully. There isn't time, Richard replied. The presentation is in 3 hours. Even if we could identify what we missed, there's no way to incorporate it into our proposal. As the executives began discussing damage control in hushed tones, Alexandra remained in the corner, still clutching her research folder. She watched Richard pace behind his desk like a caged animal, saw the panic in his eyes as he contemplated losing the most important contract in the firm's recent history. The folder in her hand seemed to grow heavier. Inside was everything Robert Hartwell had been looking for. Detailed analysis of supply chain vulnerabilities, identification of systemic risks that could affect dozens of companies, and comprehensive recommendations that could position Hartwell ahead of potential failures. There has to be something we can do, Richard muttered. Some way to salvage this situation. Alexandra took a deep breath, her heart pounding with adrenaline that comes from standing at the edge of a cliff. What she was about to do would either vindicate months of hard work or confirm Richard's assessment of her incompetence in the most public way possible. Mr. Blackstone, she said, her voice cutting through the worried conversations like a knife. Richard looked up sharply, apparently having forgotten she was still there. His expressions cycled through surprise, irritation, and finally something approaching desperation. Miss Chen, I thought I made clear you were to leave immediately. Sir, Alexandra replied, her voice steadier than it had been all morning. I believe I have the research Mr. Hartwell was referring to. The office fell completely silent. Even the executives stopped their whispered conversations to stare at her with expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. The idea that the intern they'd just watched get fired for incompetence might hold the key to saving their most important account was almost insulting. Richard stared at her for a long moment, searching her face for any sign she was bluffing. Miss Chen, what exactly are you talking about? Alexandra lifted the manila folder slightly, her hands no longer shaking despite the enormity of her claim. The supply chain vulnerabilities Mr. Hartwell mentioned, the systemic risks that could affect dozens of companies, the comprehensive analysis that could position his company ahead of potential failures. It's all in here. She gestured toward the folder, containing 3 months of her life. This is what I was trying to show you when you fired me for incompetence. The silence was so complete that the rain against the windows seemed deafening. Richard's face went through expressions suggesting he was processing possibilities he'd never considered. You're telling me, he said slowly, that you've identified the same vulnerabilities that just cost us a $40 million client. Not just identified them, Alexandra replied, confidence growing with each word. I've analyzed them, traced their implications across the entire supply network, and developed comprehensive strategies for mitigating them. That's what I spent 3 months working on. Peterson let out a sound that might have been laughter if it wasn't so bitter. Richard, you can't seriously be considering this. She's an intern who's been here 3 months. Only an intern, Alexandra said, turning to face him, who apparently identified critical vulnerabilities that a room full of Harvard and Wharton MBAs completely missed. The accusation hung in the air, and nobody could deny its accuracy. The preliminary proposal that had disappointed Robert Hartwell had been prepared by these same senior executives. Richard moved away from his desk and approached Alexandra directly, his expression showing desperate calculation. Miss Chen, you understand what you're claiming. You're saying that you, working alone as an intern, accomplished analysis our senior staff couldn't? I'm saying I approached the problem from a different angle, Alexandra replied carefully. Sometimes being an outsider gives you perspectives that insiders can't see. She opened her folder and extracted a single page. the executive summary that synthesized months of detailed research. Mr. Hartwell mentioned systemic vulnerabilities that could affect dozens of companies. This summary outlines exactly those vulnerabilities and their potential impacts. Richard took the page with unsteady hands, his eyes scanning the content with growing intensity. As he read, his expression shifted from skepticism to surprise to something approaching awe. "Where did you get this data?" he asked, his voice hushed. "Public sources, mostly," Alexandra replied. "SEC filings, industry reports, supplier databases, academic research. The information was available. It just required looking at it from a systemic perspective rather than focusing on individual company problems." Richard continued reading, his eyes moving quickly as he absorbed implications that could transform their understanding of the entire engagement. The senior executives watched his face intently, trying to gauge whether Alexandra's claims had validity. "This analysis," Richard said finally, barely above a whisper, "it's exactly what Hartwell was looking for. The supply chain vulnerabilities, the systemic risks, the comprehensive approach. It's all here." He looked up at Alexandra with an expression she'd never seen before, something that might have been respect mixed with disbelief. "Miss Chen, how long did this analysis take you?" 3 months of intensive work," she replied. "Nights, weekends, everything. I wanted to produce something that would really contribute to the firm's success." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The intern fired for incompetence had apparently produced the exact research that could save the firm's most important client relationship. Richard handed the executive summary to Peterson, who read it with growing amazement. "Richard, this is extraordinary work. The depth of analysis, the innovative connections. I've never seen anything like this from an intern." "Because you never bothered to look at what she was producing," Richard said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. He turned back to Alexandra, his expression showing the kind of desperation that comes from recognizing salvation might be possible, but at enormous cost to one's pride. "Miss Chen, how much of this analysis do you have completed?" "Complete comprehensive report," Alexandra replied, patting the thick folder. "Detailed analysis of vulnerabilities, specific recommendations for Hartwell, mitigation strategies, timeline projections, risk assessments, everything needed for a complete presentation." Richard stared at the folder as if it contained salvation itself. The research that could save his most important client relationship, preserve his firm's reputation, and generate millions in revenue was sitting in front of him, produced by the intern he'd just fired for incompetence. "The presentation is in 3 hours," Peterson said nervously. "Even if this research is as good as it appears, there's no way to integrate it into our existing proposal." "We don't integrate it," Richard said, his voice taking on the tone of someone who'd made a crucial decision. "We scrap our existing proposal entirely and build a new presentation around this research." The executives exchanged worried glances. Starting over completely hours before the most important presentation in recent memory was an enormous risk. "Richard," Peterson said carefully, "are you sure? We're talking about betting the entire Hartwell account on research done by an intern." "Research done by an intern who understood the client's needs better than any of us," Richard replied sharply. He turned back to Alexandra, his expression showing a mixture of desperation and growing respect. "Miss Chen, I need complete honesty. Are you confident in this research? Are you prepared to stake your career on its accuracy and value?" Alexandra looked around at the faces of the men who had spent the morning humiliating her. The irony was overwhelming. They were now asking her to save them from their own arrogance. "Mr. Blackstone," she said, her voice carrying strength that surprised her, "you already destroyed my career this morning. You fired me for incompetence and threatened negative references that would prevent me from working in this industry. What exactly do I have left to lose?" The question hung like a challenge, and Richard had the grace to look uncomfortable as he confronted the implications of his earlier actions. However, Alexandra continued, I am completely confident in this research. I've checked and rechecked every analysis, verified every data source, and tested every conclusion. This work represents the best analysis I'm capable of producing. Richard nodded slowly, processing not just her words, but the implications of what she was offering. Miss Chen, if we use your research for this presentation, if it saves the Hartwell account, what would you want in return? I want my job back, she said simply. Not just my internship, but a real position with real responsibilities and real respect for the work I can do. And if the presentation fails, Alexandra smiled for the first time that morning, then I'll be exactly where I was 30 minutes ago, fired for incompetence and blacklisted from the industry. At least this way, my work will have been evaluated on its merits. Richard extended his hand, a gesture carrying enormous symbolic weight. Miss Chen, I believe we have an agreement. Abriki, if you're as amazed by this incredible turnaround as I am, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more inspiring stories. But trust me, this is just the beginning of Alexandra's amazing journey. Let's see what happens when she gets her chance to prove everyone wrong. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of frantic activity that transformed Blackstone Consulting's executive offices into something resembling a war room. Conference tables were cleared and covered with printouts, whiteboards were wheeled in and filled with diagrams, and every available senior executive was pressed into service to help reorganize their entire presentation strategy around Alexandra's research. Richard Blackstone found himself in the unprecedented position of deferring to the judgment of someone he'd fired for incompetence just hours earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him as he watched Alexandra methodically explain complex supply chain relationships to men with decades more experience. The key insight, Alexandra explained to the assembled group, using a laser pointer to highlight connections on a flowchart, is that Hartwell's vulnerabilities aren't isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a systemic weakness in the entire supplier network that's been building for 18 months. Dajenhi, the senior executives leaned forward, finally paying the attention to her words that they should have given months earlier. The transformation in their attitudes was remarkable. Traditional consulting approaches focus on optimizing existing relationships, Alexandra continued, moving to a new slide showing comparative data across multiple suppliers. But what my research reveals is that the entire framework of supplier interdependence is becoming unstable. Richard studied the data with growing amazement, seeing patterns his experienced team had completely missed, despite having access to the same information. Miss Chen, how did you identify these patterns when our analysts didn't see them? Because I wasn't looking for the problems we expected to find, Alexandra replied. I started with the assumption that conventional wisdom might be wrong, and I let the data lead me to conclusions rather than trying to fit data into preconceived frameworks. The admission was damning for the senior staff, who had apparently approached Hartwell with assumptions that prevented them from seeing actual risks. The solutions I'm proposing, Alexandra said, advancing to recommendations, aren't just fixes for Hartwell's current problems. They're strategies that will position the company to avoid supply chain failures that could devastate their competitors. Peterson raised his hand tentatively. Miss Chen, some of these recommendations seem quite radical. Are you confident Hartwell would implement such dramatic changes? Alexandra smiled with the confidence of someone who'd done thorough homework. Mr. Peterson, I've analyzed Hartwell's corporate culture, their decision-making patterns, and their historical response to challenges. These recommendations are designed specifically to align with their organizational strengths while addressing their vulnerabilities. She clicked to a new slide showing detailed implementation timelines. Furthermore, I've structured recommendations so they can be implemented incrementally, allowing Hartwell to test and validate each phase before committing to the next level. Richard nodded approvingly as he reviewed the implementation strategy. This is exactly the kind of thoughtful approach that appeals to manufacturing executives. Miss Chen, how did you develop such insight into Hartwell's culture? I spent time reading everything available about the company's history, leadership philosophy, and previous strategic decisions, Alexandra replied. I also analyzed their public communications, hiring patterns, and partnership choices to understand their decision-making process. The level of preparation was extraordinary, representing the kind of deep research that typically took teams of consultants weeks to complete. Ms. Chen, another executive said, your analysis suggests these supply chain vulnerabilities will affect dozens of companies over the next year. Have you identified potential follow-up opportunities that could emerge from a successful Hartwell engagement? Alexandra's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. Actually, yes. Based on my research, I've identified at least 12 companies in Hartwell's network that will face similar challenges over the next 18 months. A successful engagement with Hartwell could position us as leading experts in supply chain transformation. Richard leaned back, his expression showing mixture of admiration and disbelief. Miss Chen, you're describing a potential business line worth hundreds of millions over the next few years. That's exactly what I'm describing, Alexandra replied confidently. The vulnerabilities I've identified aren't one-time events. They're ongoing systemic weaknesses that will create consulting opportunities for firms that understand how to help companies navigate these challenges successfully. The implications were staggering. What had started as a single client engagement could become the foundation for an entirely new expertise area that would set Blackstone apart from competitors for years. As the team worked frantically to incorporate Alexandra's research into a coherent presentation, the atmosphere shifted from desperate damage control to something approaching excitement. The senior executives who had dismissed her work were now recognizing they might be looking at the most innovative consulting proposal in the firm's history. We need to completely restructure our presentation format, Richard announced. Traditional consulting presentations won't do justice to the scope and innovation of this analysis. I've already prepared a presentation framework, Alexandra said quietly, producing another section of her comprehensive folder. I designed it specifically to highlight strategic insights while providing clear, actionable recommendations aligned with Hartwell's preferences. Richard stared at her with an expression suggesting he was seeing her clearly for the first time. Miss Chen, did you prepare this entire presentation on your own initiative? I prepared everything needed for a complete client engagement, Alexandra replied. Research, analysis, recommendations, implementation strategies, presentation materials, risk assessments, and follow-up plans. I wanted to be ready for any opportunity to contribute meaningfully. The scope of her preparation was unprecedented for an intern, representing comprehensive work typically divided among multiple team members over several months. Miss Chen, Richard said slowly, I'm beginning to understand that my assessment of your capabilities may have been not just wrong, but spectacularly wrong. The admission was painful but necessary. Mr. Blackstone, I understand why you reached the conclusions you did. My background doesn't suggest the kind of expertise this work required. Your background, Richard replied, is irrelevant compared to the quality of work you've produced. I made assumptions based on superficial characteristics rather than evaluating your actual capabilities. As the team continued preparation, word of the morning's dramatic events began spreading through the office. Other employees, hearing rumors about the intern who'd been fired and then recalled to save the firm's most important account, found excuses to walk past the conference room where Alexandra was explaining complex strategic concepts to senior executives who listened with unprecedented attention. We need to address the elephant in the room, Richard announced as they neared completion. Miss Chen, how do we explain to Robert Hartwell that our most innovative insights come from someone we initially positioned as a junior team member? Alexandra had been thinking about this challenge throughout the afternoon's preparations. Mr. Blackstone, I don't think we need to apologize for where good ideas come from. Mr. Hartwell is looking for innovation and fresh thinking. The fact that it comes from an unexpected source might actually reinforce the value of our approach. She's right, Peterson agreed. Hartwell specifically criticized us for conventional thinking. Highlighting the diversity of our team's perspectives could be seen as a strength. Richard nodded thoughtfully. Miss Chen, are you prepared to present your research directly to Robert Hartwell? This isn't just about having good ideas. It's about convincing a skeptical CEO we can deliver results. I'm prepared, Alexandra replied without hesitation. I've been preparing for this opportunity for 3 months. I know this research better than anyone, and I'm confident in my ability to present it effectively. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Richard said, his expression becoming serious. Miss Chen, regardless of how this presentation goes, I owe you an apology for my behavior this morning. My treatment of you was unprofessional, unfair, and completely unjustified. The unexpected apology brought silence to the busy conference room. Alexandra looked around at the faces of executives who had witnessed her humiliation and were now seeing their CEO acknowledge his mistake publicly. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on your background, rather than evaluating the quality of your work, Richard continued. That was wrong, and it nearly cost this firm its most important client relationship. I appreciate the apology, Mr. Blackstone, Alexandra replied diplomatically. I think we all learned something about the dangers of underestimating people based on superficial characteristics. As final preparations were completed, Alexandra found herself in the surreal position of being the center of attention in a room full of senior executives who had dismissed her just hours earlier. The transformation was complete, but she understood the real test was still coming. The Hartwell presentation would determine not just whether her research could save a $40 million contract, but whether she had truly earned the respect and recognition that had been denied for so long. The offices of Hartwell Manufacturing occupied 2 floors of a gleaming tower in Chicago's financial district, their conference rooms offering panoramic views of the city and Lake Michigan. As the Blackstone team arrived for what could be the most important presentation in the firm's history, the afternoon sun was breaking through storm clouds, casting dramatic patterns of light and shadow across the urban landscape. Robert Hartwell's executive conference room was a study in understated power, with a massive table surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. The walls displayed photographs of manufacturing facilities worldwide, each representing a piece of the industrial empire Robert had built over 2 decades. Robert Hartwell himself was exactly what Alexandra had expected from her research. A tall, lean man in his early 50s with prematurely grey hair and the focused intensity that came from building a billion-dollar company from modest beginnings. He wore a simple blue suit that conveyed both authority and accessibility, and his handshake was firm without being aggressive. Richard, Robert said as the Blackstone team entered, I have to admit I'm curious whether this afternoon's presentation will be more promising than your preliminary proposal. The comment was delivered with diplomatic directness, polite enough to maintain professional relationships, but clear enough to communicate disappointment. Robert, Richard replied, his voice carrying more confidence than Alexandra had expected. I think you're going to find our approach to your situation is quite different from what you've seen before. As the team settled around the massive conference table, Alexandra found herself positioned directly across from Robert Hartwell, who studied her with casual curiosity. She was clearly the youngest person in the room by at least 15 years, and her modest attire marked her as someone outside the usual circles of senior consulting executives. Robert, Richard began, before we start our formal presentation, I'd like to introduce Alexandra Chen, who has led our research efforts on your account. Robert's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly surprised that someone so young would be described as leading research for such an important engagement. Miss Chen, it's a pleasure to meet you. What's your background in manufacturing consulting? The question was polite, but pointed, and Alexandra understood Robert was trying to gauge whether she had expertise necessary to understand his company's complex challenges. Mr. Hartwell, Alexandra replied, meeting his gaze directly, I don't have traditional manufacturing consulting experience. But what I do have is 3 months of intensive research focused specifically on your company and the broader supply chain vulnerabilities affecting your sector. I see, Robert said, his tone neutral but expression suggesting genuine interest. And what conclusions did your research lead you to? Alexandra opened her presentation folder, confidence growing as she prepared to share insights that had consumed her life. Mr. Hartwell, I believe the challenges your company is facing aren't isolated operational issues. They're symptoms of systemic vulnerabilities in the supplier network that require entirely new approaches to mitigate. Robert leaned back, his expression showing focused attention that indicated she'd said something resonating with his own thinking. Miss Chen, that's a very different perspective from other consulting firms. Can you elaborate? Certainly, Alexandra replied, advancing to her first slide, showing a complex diagram of supply chain relationships and vulnerability points. Traditional consulting approaches would focus on optimizing your existing supplier relationships and processes, but my research indicates that the framework itself is becoming unstable. She used her laser pointer to highlight specific connections. What we're seeing is a convergence of supplier consolidation, increased interdependence, and inadequate risk distribution that's creating systemic vulnerabilities throughout the network. Robert studied the diagram intently, his expression showing growing interest as he recognized patterns aligning with his own observations about industry changes. Miss Chen, these vulnerabilities you've identified, how confident are you in their accuracy and implications? Completely confident, Alexandra replied without hesitation. I've verified this analysis using multiple data sources, cross-referenced it with historical patterns, and tested the conclusions against documented supply chain failures in other industries. Furthermore, she continued, advancing to a new slide showing specific examples of companies that had successfully mitigated similar risks. I've identified multiple case studies demonstrating how companies can not only protect themselves from these vulnerabilities, but emerge more resilient and competitive. Richard watched the exchange with fascination, seeing Robert Hartwell's skepticism gradually transform into engagement as Alexandra systematically presented insights addressing his concerns directly. Miss Chen, Robert said, his voice now showing genuine enthusiasm, what you're describing aligns perfectly with vulnerabilities I've been observing in our network. But none of the other consulting firms identified these systemic risks. How did you see what they missed? I think it's partly because I approached the problem without preconceived notions about what solutions should look like, Alexandra replied thoughtfully. I let the data guide me to conclusions rather than trying to fit data into existing frameworks. That's exactly what I've been looking for, Robert said, leaning forward. Fresh thinking that isn't constrained by conventional consulting wisdom. As Alexandra continued her presentation, systematically addressing each concern Robert had raised in his morning phone call, the atmosphere shifted from professional skepticism to genuine excitement. The senior Blackstone executives watched in amazement as their former intern demonstrated insight and presentation skill exceeding anything they'd expected. The recommendations I'm proposing, Alexandra said, advancing to her solutions section, are designed to position Hartwell Manufacturing not just to survive potential supply chain disruptions, but to maintain competitive advantages while your competitors struggle with vulnerabilities. She outlined a comprehensive strategy addressing both immediate risk mitigation and long-term competitive positioning, with specific timelines, resource requirements, and success metrics for each phase. Miss Chen, Robert interrupted, his excitement now clearly visible. These recommendations are exactly what I've been hoping to find. They address not just our current concerns, but they position us for the supply chain challenges I know are coming. Furthermore, Alexandra continued, successful implementation of these strategies would position Hartwell as a model for other companies facing similar vulnerabilities, creating opportunities for knowledge sharing and industry leadership that could generate additional revenue streams. Robert's eyes lit up at the implications. You're talking about consulting opportunities for us, using our transformation experience to help other companies in our network. Exactly, Alexandra confirmed. The vulnerabilities I've identified will affect dozens of companies over the next year. Hartwell could become the recognized leader in navigating these challenges successfully. Richard watched the exchange with growing amazement, realizing Alexandra wasn't just saving the Hartwell account, she was potentially creating an entirely new business opportunity, benefiting both companies for years. Miss Chen, Robert said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd found exactly what he was looking for. This is the most innovative and comprehensive analysis I've seen from any consulting firm. How quickly could your team begin implementation? We could start immediately, Alexandra replied confidently. I've developed detailed implementation plans for each phase, with specific resource requirements and timeline projections. Richard, Robert said, turning to the Blackstone CEO, I want to move forward with this proposal immediately. Miss Chen's research has identified exactly the kind of innovative solutions I've been seeking. The words Richard had been hoping to hear all day were finally spoken, but the irony wasn't lost on him that they came in response to work by the intern he'd fired for incompetence just hours earlier. Robert, we're thrilled to have the opportunity to work with Hartwell Manufacturing, Richard replied, though his voice carried a note of humility that hadn't been there that morning. Miss Chen will be leading our engagement team, given her deep understanding of your situation and the industry dynamics involved. Robert nodded approvingly. Miss Chen, I'm looking forward to working with you directly on this transformation. Your insights could revolutionize how we approach supply chain challenges. As the meeting concluded, with handshakes and agreements about next steps, Alexandra found herself in the surreal position of being congratulated by the same people who had witnessed her humiliation just hours earlier. The ride back to Blackstone's offices was subdued, with each team member processing the magnitude of what they'd experienced. The intern fired for incompetence had not only saved the firm's most important client relationship, but had potentially created a new business line worth hundreds of millions. Miss Chen, Richard said finally, breaking the silence, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you recognition for work that has exceeded anything I've seen in 30 years of consulting. Furthermore, he continued, I want to offer you a permanent position with our firm, not as an intern, but as a senior consultant with responsibility for developing our new supply chain transformation practice. Alexandra looked out at the Chicago skyline, processing the extraordinary events of the day. 12 hours earlier, she'd been an intern hoping for recognition. 6 hours earlier, she'd been fired for incompetence. Now, she was being offered a senior position based on work that had transformed her firm's most important client relationship. Mr. Blackstone, she said finally, I accept your offer, but I want to make sure this firm learns from today's events. Competence and insight can come from anywhere, and we need to create an environment where people are judged by their contributions rather than their backgrounds. Agreed completely, Richard replied. Today's events have taught me that our assumptions about talent and capability may be preventing us from recognizing valuable contributions from unexpected sources. As they returned to the office, Alexandra reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from humiliation to vindication in a single day. The morning had been about prejudice and assumptions. The afternoon had been about merit and achievement. But as she looked ahead to the challenges of implementing the transformation strategy she'd developed, Alexandra understood the real work was just beginning. She had proven she belonged at the highest levels of consulting, but now she had to deliver on the promises she'd made. The weeks that followed Alexandra's dramatic presentation passed in a whirlwind of activity that transformed not only her career trajectory, but the entire culture of Blackstone Consulting. The $40 million contract had been signed within days, and word of the young consultant's innovative approach had begun spreading throughout Chicago's business community. Alexandra's new office, located just doors from Richard Blackstone's executive suite, was a far cry from the cramped intern cubicle she'd occupied weeks earlier. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered commanding views of Lake Michigan, and the mahogany desk and leather chairs spoke of corporate success that most people spent decades trying to achieve. The transformation at Hartwell Manufacturing was proceeding ahead of schedule, with early implementation results exceeding even Alexandra's optimistic projections. The supply chain vulnerabilities she'd identified were being systematically addressed, saving the company millions while positioning them ahead of competitors who remained exposed to systemic risks. Robert Hartwell had become one of Alexandra's strongest advocates, frequently referring other executives to Blackstone Consulting, specifically to work with the brilliant young consultant who revolutionized our approach to supply chain challenges. "Miss Chen," Margaret Walsh announced over the intercom, "Mr. Blackstone would like to see you when convenient." Alexandra saved the analysis she'd been reviewing and made her way to Richard's office, wondering what new challenge or opportunity awaited. The past month had brought a steady stream of new clients, all seeking the kind of innovative analysis that had transformed the Hartwell engagement. She knocked softly on the familiar doors, remembering with vivid clarity the last time she'd stood in this spot, clutching her research folder and hoping for recognition. The memory of that morning's humiliation seemed almost surreal, given how dramatically her circumstances had changed. "Come in, Alexandra," Richard called out, his voice carrying warmth that would have been unimaginable during their first encounter. She entered to find Richard standing by the windows, looking out at the city skyline, with an expression of satisfaction suggesting good news was forthcoming. "Alexandra, I wanted to share some exciting news," Richard began, gesturing for her to sit. "I just finished a conference call with the partners, and we've made a decision about the future of our supply chain transformation practice." Alexandra sat carefully, her mind racing through possibilities that might warrant a formal partners meeting. The transformation practice had been successful beyond anyone's expectations, but she hadn't anticipated it would become a topic for the firm's highest-level strategic discussions. Based on the extraordinary success of the Hartwell engagement and the interest we're receiving from potential clients across multiple industry sectors, Richard continued, the partners have decided to establish supply chain transformation consulting as a separate division within Blackstone. The implications were staggering. Creating a separate division meant significant investment in resources, staff, and infrastructure, the kind of commitment signaling the partners' confidence in the long-term viability of Alexandra's approach. "Furthermore," Richard said, his smile growing broader, "we'd like you to serve as the founding director of Supply Chain Transformation Consulting, with full responsibility for developing the practice, hiring staff, and managing client relationships." Alexandra felt her breath catch as she processed the magnitude of what Richard was offering. Director-level positions at firms like Blackstone were typically reserved for executives with decades of experience and proven track records. The idea that someone just months out of her internship would be offered such responsibility was unprecedented. "Mr. Blackstone," she said carefully, "I'm honored by your confidence, but are you certain someone with my limited experience is ready for this level of responsibility?" Richard leaned back, his expression becoming more serious as he considered her question. "Alexandra, 6 weeks ago, I would have agreed with your assessment, but what you've accomplished since then has forced me to reconsider how we evaluate readiness and capability. He gestured toward a stack of folders on his desk, each representing a potential client who had specifically requested to work with Alexandra. You've generated more high-quality leads in 6 weeks than most senior consultants produce in a year. The Hartwell transformation is being studied as a case example at business schools, and we're receiving inquiries from companies around the world. But more importantly, Richard continued, you've demonstrated exactly the kind of innovative thinking and client focus that defines exceptional leadership. The question isn't whether you have enough experience by traditional measures. It's whether you have the vision and capability to build something extraordinary. Alexandra looked out the windows at the Chicago skyline, processing the implications of what Richard was proposing. The opportunity was everything she had dreamed of, and more, but it also represented challenges that would test every skill she had developed. Mr. Blackstone, if I accept this position, I want to ensure we're building something sustainable. The transformation practice can't be dependent on any single person, including me. We need to create systems and methodologies that will deliver consistent value regardless of who's leading individual engagements. Richard nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking I was hoping to hear. Alexandra, what would you need to make this division successful? First, we'll need to hire the right people, Alexandra replied, her mind already working through operational requirements. Not necessarily people with traditional consulting backgrounds, but individuals who can think systemically and aren't constrained by conventional approaches. Second, we'll need to invest in research capabilities that go beyond what most consulting firms provide. The kind of deep analysis that created our advantage with Hartwell requires significant resources and specialized expertise. And third, she continued, we'll need to establish partnerships with academic institutions and research organizations that can help us stay ahead of emerging trends and technological developments. Richard listened intently as Alexandra outlined her vision for building the new division, impressed by the scope and sophistication of her thinking. Alexandra, what you're describing sounds like a substantial investment. Do you have projections for potential return? Based on our current pipeline and the inquiries we're receiving, I project the Supply Chain Transformation Consulting Division could generate between $100 and $200 million in revenue within 3 years, Alexandra replied confidently. The numbers were staggering, representing the kind of growth that could transform Blackstone Consulting from a successful regional firm into a national powerhouse. Furthermore, Alexandra continued, successful implementation of transformation strategies with our initial clients will create a network effect that should generate additional opportunities across their supplier networks and competitive ecosystems. Richard stood and moved to the windows, looking out at the city while processing the implications of Alexandra's analysis. The opportunity she was describing could position Blackstone as a leader in an entirely new category of business services. Alexandra, I want you to develop a comprehensive business plan for the Supply Chain Transformation Consulting Division. Include staffing requirements, resource needs, partnership strategies, and detailed financial projections. Present it to the full partnership next month. I'll have it ready, Alexandra replied, already mentally organizing the research and analysis required to support such a comprehensive proposal. There's one more thing, Richard said, turning back to face her. I want you to know that what happened during our first meeting has fundamentally changed how I approach talent evaluation and development. Your success has taught me that capability often appears in unexpected forms. Alexandra appreciated the acknowledgement, though the memory of that morning's humiliation still carried emotional weight despite her subsequent success. Mr. Blackstone, I think we both learned important lessons from that experience. Indeed we did, Richard agreed. And I want to ensure that Blackstone Consulting never again makes the mistake of underestimating someone based on superficial characteristics rather than actual performance. As Alexandra prepared to leave Richard's office, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from intern to division director in just weeks. The transformation had been dramatic, but she understood the real challenges lay ahead as she worked to build a consulting practice that could deliver on the promises she'd made. Looking back at the morning when she'd been called incompetent and fired for challenging the status quo, Alexandra understood that sometimes the most valuable lessons come wrapped in the most difficult experiences. She had learned that resilience, preparation, and the courage to stand up for your convictions could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. The intern had become the director, the incompetent had become indispensable, and the young woman who had been written off was now responsible for one of the most innovative consulting practices in the industry. But more importantly, she had demonstrated that competence, innovation, and leadership could come from anywhere, and that the people you underestimate the most might be the ones who can transform your entire understanding of what's possible. As she prepared for another day of challenging clients and complex problems, Alexandra understood that her success was just the beginning of a much larger story about the power of diverse perspectives, the value of fresh thinking, and the extraordinary things that could happen when organizations learn to look beyond superficial characteristics to recognize true capability. The morning that had begun with the words, "Get out, you're incompetent," had evolved into a career defined by innovation, leadership, and the kind of success that came from proving that sometimes the most valuable contributions come from the most unexpected sources. And that incredible transformation reminds us all that talent and determination can overcome any obstacle, that fresh perspectives often provide the most valuable insights, and that the people we underestimate might be the ones who can change everything. If Alexandra's journey from humiliation to triumph inspired you as much as it did me, please show your support by giving this video a thumbs up, subscribing to our channel for more amazing stories of perseverance and success, and hitting that notification bell so you never miss our latest content. What did you think of Alexandra's incredible rise from intern to director? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how this story of transformation and vindication resonated with you. Remember, sometimes the greatest successes come after the most challenging setbacks, and the most important thing is to never give up on believing in your own potential.